So friends, we're going to begin, so we keep on schedule. And I know that there are people out there, they'll trickle in as soon as they hear us start, maybe. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, Jerry McKenny. He's the Walter Chair of Christian Ethics and Moral Theology in the Department of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of two major books. One in the area of bioethics, entitled To Relieve the Human Condition, and one book on the theoretical foundations of moral theology, called The Analogy of Grace, Karl Barth's Moral Theology, from Oxford in 2010. He's also the author of some 35 articles and book chapters in Christian ethics, biomedical ethics, the ethics of biotechnology, religious ethics, and the philosophy of medicine. He has co-edited 3 books, including one entitled The Ethical, from Blackwell in 2003, and Altering Nature, the 2-volume work from Springer in 2008. He's nearing the completion of a book on Christian ethics and biotechnology, and has begun work on another book on eschatological political theology. At Notre Dame, he's also served as director of the John J. Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values for 8 years. He'll speak to us today on the topic, dignity, biological nature, and human enhancement. So please join me in welcoming Jerry McKenny.
Thank you to John Cavadini for organizing this conference and inviting me to it, and to Jessica, if she's here, for running it so competently and making us all feel at ease here. The title of my remarks are Human Dignity, Biological Nature, and Human Enhancement. I feel like this is unpleasantly echoing, or is it just me? It's okay? Okay, thank you. Catholics and other Christians often base the dignity of the human person on the image of God, in which human beings are created and into which they are to grow. On the best accounts, the dignity of the person is held to include her biological nature, as well as the spiritual, cognitive, and emotional aspects of her nature. The extension of the dignity of the person to her biological nature poses the question of what implications follow for efforts to determine biological characteristics by biotechnology. In what follows, I will have in mind, although I'm not going to talk about them specifically, interventions, whether genetic, pharmaceutical, or neurological, which have permanent effects on biological functions or traits, such as cognition, emotion, and longevity. Such efforts are in their infancy, and most of them may never be realized. But they pose the question of human dignity in ways that deserve our attention. I will consider 2 ways in which this question has been posed in official Catholic statements. According to one line of thought, the inviolability of the person, which extends to her biological nature, grounds the principle that biological nature is not at the disposal of human beings. A second line of thought focuses on human dignity as conformity to Christ. In what follows, I'll consider both of these lines of thought. I'll argue that the first one fails to rule out efforts to determine biological characteristics, but does cast reasonable suspicion on such efforts, while the second one dissolves an argument that is often made for biotechnological enhancement, especially in Christian contexts. And by the way, the reason I'm focusing, I have to say that the reason I'm focusing on Catholic statements is because unfortunately no Protestant communion has come up with something so worth engaging. but I hope that I will be able to make clear why it's important, what these statements say is important. So let's take the first of these lines of thought, human dignity and the non-disposability of human biological nature. Current Catholic teaching rejects specific aspect accounts of the image of God, which locate the image of God in some specific characteristic, such as rationality, in favor of whole human accounts, according to which it pertains to human beings in their whole nature as body and soul. The image of God, so understood, is the ground of human dignity, and it follows that the whole human being, as body and soul, shares in the dignity that human beings have as creatures in the image of God. Among other things, dignity confers a kind of inviolability on human beings. And inasmuch as dignity extends to the body, human biological nature shares the inviolability that applies to the human person as body and soul. To quote Pope St. John Paul II, the biological nature of each person is untouchable in the sense that it is constitutive of the personal identity of the individual throughout the whole course of his history. To respect the dignity of man, consequently, amounts to safeguarding this identity of the man, corpore et anima unus. End quote. In the context of biological nature, inviolability or untouchability means, among other things, that human bodies cannot be destroyed, assaulted, tortured, or mutilated. The question I pose is whether it is also the case that their biological characteristics cannot be altered or otherwise determined by biotechnology. Does the inviolability or untouchability of the biological nature of the person entail the impermissibility of determining her biological characteristics? It is significant that John Paul II declined to draw this implication in the address I just quoted, which was delivered in 1983. In that address, the Pope suggests that non-therapeutic genetic interventions, or what we perhaps imprecisely call enhancements, may be permissible if they meet certain moral conditions, which include the protection of nascent human life in the procreative act, and the avoidance of germline modifications and interventions that could produce subhuman or superhuman beings. But the Pope also issues warnings against reducing human beings to their biological nature, treating them as objects, regarding them as deficient in their current state, and subjecting them to the caprice of others. These warnings suggest that even if genetic enhancement does not violate basic moral norms, it may express attitudes and stances towards human persons that are inconsistent with respect for their dignity. The point of the warnings is to cast suspicion on the determination of genetic characteristics without ruling it out in principle. Nevertheless, the fact that the address stops short of a prohibition of genetic enhancement is significant. It implies that the inviolability or untouchability of the biological nature of the human person is not in principle incompatible with the determination of her biological characteristics. I think John Paul II is right, but now I want to consider a more recent statement. Communion and Stewardship, published in 2004, also stops short of an explicit prohibition of biotechnological enhancement, but it eliminates the ambiguity of Pope John Paul II's address, leaving little doubt that the inviolability of human biological nature is incompatible with the determination of biological characteristics. Again, the dignity of the human person and the inviolability it implies extends to her biological nature. But now the inviolability of biological nature is introduced with the question of whether it is at the disposal of human beings. Do human beings have a right to put their biological nature at their disposal a title to determine its characteristics as they see fit. CNS, I'm going to call communion stewardship CNS just to avoid continually pronouncing it, makes clear that what is at stake in this question. The right fully, this is a quote, the right fully to dispose of the body would imply that the person may use the body as a means to an end he himself has chosen. That is, that he may replace its parts, modify, or terminate it. Well, what exactly is meant by putting biological nature at our disposal? In the passage I just quoted, it involves instrumentalizing biological nature as a means to an end one has chosen for oneself. More specifically, determination of someone's genetic characteristics instrumentalizes the unique identity of the person, which consists in part in her genetic characteristics, as a means to the improvement of these characteristics. But there's also a second sense in which, according to CNS, biological nature is put at our disposal. To determine a person's genetic characteristics violates the autonomy of that person, who has no say in the determination of her characteristics. On the surface, these 2 points are unconvincing. The first point seems to imply that the determiner subordinates the person to an extraneous end. Something like that does occur, I think, in the selection of embryos for implantation based on their genetic characteristics, and in eugenic programs of all kinds. But it would not seem to occur in cases of enhancing functions or traits of an existing child for his overall benefit. The second point assumes that the person has a say in the initial determination of her genetic characteristics, which is denied to her when others determine those characteristics. But no one has autonomy in the initial determination of her genes, and where one has no autonomy, there is none to be violated. The criticisms I have just pressed, these 2 criticisms against CNS, would be pressed by most secular bioethics, and indeed they are almost ad nauseum. Nevertheless, in claiming that the determination of genetic characteristics by others instrumentalizes the identity of the person and violates her autonomy, CNS finds a perhaps unlikely ally in the secular German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Like CNS, Habermas argues for the non-disposability of the biological nature of the person on the grounds that the dignity that attaches to the human person extends to her biological nature as inseparable from her personhood. Because the person is inseparable from her physical embodiment, the dignity that attaches to the person extends to her biological nature. Habermas makes the strongest case I know of for the position taken by CNS, and his defense of this position proves that it is not merely a Catholic, a more generally Christian, or even a theistic position, but one that can be articulated on secular philosophical grounds. Even so, I think that Habermas fails in the end to defend the non-disposability of human biological nature. That failure also implicates CNS, and I will conclude that we should return to John Paul II's position. But first, Habermas. For Habermas, the dignity of persons is the basis of modern political orders, which depend on the mutual recognition of citizens as autonomous subjects who speak in their own person in the intersubjective determination of public norms. In Habermas's words, quote, "If we see ourselves as moral persons, we intuitively assume that we act and judge in propria persona, that is, that it is our own voice speaking and no other," end quote. In other words, personhood entails the capacity to speak and act in one's own person. Employing Helmut Plessner's distinction between being a body and having a body, Habermas also argues that one's own person includes one's physical embodiment. On these grounds, Habermas worries that if one's personhood, so understood, is not separable from biological nature, then parents who determine their child's genetic characteristics could threaten his capacity to speak and act in his own person. To explain Habermas's position, we should distinguish three claims. First, the claim that is made by CNS that a person's unique identity and autonomy are threatened by the mere fact that her biological nature has been disposed over. I have suggested that this claim is unconvincing as it stands. A second claim made by Habermas seems more plausible. It is not the fact that one's genetic characteristics have been determined that is the problem, but rather that those characteristics have been determined by another person. When one's genetic characteristics are determined by another person, that person enters into one's self-constitution. As Habermas puts it, the capacity of being oneself, of acting and speaking in propria persona, is threatened by the intrusion of the intention of another person into one's life history. This second claim explains how identity and autonomy are at stake in the determination of genetic characteristics, but it's not convincing either. The notion that one's identity and sense of oneself as autonomous are threatened merely by the fact that another person has entered into one's identity formation assumes that identity and a sense of autonomy can emerge only in a space that is devoid of the influence of others. That is a highly individualistic conception, and in any case, no one ever inhabits such a space. But Habermas makes a third claim, and this one is more interesting. According to this claim, a person whose genetic characteristics have been determined by another may find it difficult to understand herself as speaking and acting in her own person, not simply because she's aware that her parents have chosen part of her biological nature, but because she fails to identify with the particular biological nature they have chosen for her. In such a case, Habermas suggests she may be unable to claim her life history as her own, not simply because the intentions of another have intruded into it, but because she happens not to endorse the particular traits that have been chosen for her or the form of life those traits have equipped her for. In her biological nature, she is, at least in part, the product of values of others, which turn out not to be her own values. And it is in this sense that her identity and sense of autonomy are compromised. By contrast, a person whose genetic characteristics have been chosen by her parents, but who, on becoming aware of their origin, endorses their choices, would not doubt her identity and autonomy. The second-order values that constitute her moral identity would endorse the first-order values that are embodied in her biological nature, and she would therefore act and speak entirely in propria persona. Habermas argues that this potential threat to identity and autonomy justifies moral and legal protection of the biological nature of the person as non-disposable prior to the ability to consent. Habermas's critics doubt that a person would fail to identify with the genetic characteristics her parents have chosen, an argument that was made by Thomas Nagel, Ronald Dworkin, and others. That debate must await an empirical resolution. We don't have the people who have lived long enough, we don't have the psychological studies. But in the meantime, we can ask whether a person would have a legitimate reason not to identify with the characteristics her parents have chosen. If we consider biologically implausible scenarios in which parents program their children to become musicians or athletes, it is reasonable to assume that a person might not endorse the genetic choice of her parents. But if we consider the modest contributions genes actually make to desired capacities and bodily states, and restrict genetic enhancement to improvements that would benefit a person whatever her particular values turn out to be, as most bioethicists think we should do, then it doesn't seem that a person would have reason not to endorse the genetic choices of her parents. She would be capable of acting and speaking in propria persona, notwithstanding the fact that her parents have disposed over her biological nature. Well, John Paul II, Communion and Stewardship, and Habermas all argue that the dignity of the human person extends to her biological nature and renders her biological nature untouchable. CNS and Habermas go on to argue that the inviolability of the person that is inherent in her dignity requires the non-disposability of her biological nature. Their argument rests on the claim that the determination of genetic characteristics violates the identity and autonomy of the person. But I have suggested that this claim is untenable. By contrast, John Paul II denies that the determination of genetic characteristics in itself is a threat to the dignity of the person, but he suggests that it may express attitudes and stances to the person that are incompatible with respect for her dignity. I think John Paul II is right on both counts. We do not have grounds for prohibiting the determination of biological characteristics in principle, but we do have grounds for being wary of it. But this is not the only thing to say about the dignity of human biological nature in this context. And this brings us to the second line of thought, which has to do with the image of God as conformity to Christ and the view of the dignity of human nature that is implied in that notion. So the second part of the paper, human dignity, biological nature, and conformity to Christ. What is the role of biological nature in conformity to Christ, which is, according to communion and stewardship and Gaudium et Spes, the other part of human dignity? And what does this role entail for the determination of biological characteristics? To consider this question, I take my cue from a single sentence in communion and stewardship that appears to be out of context and could easily be dismissed as an afterthought. Here's the sentence. A man can only truly improve by realizing more fully the image of God in him, by uniting himself to Christ and in imitation of him, end quote. This claim does not imply that biotechnological enhancement violates human dignity. It simply denies that it would contribute to it as the human vocation to conform to Christ. In this context, I'm interested in the arguments of two theologians, Catherine Tanner and Karl Barth, who both hold that our nature as created by God is sufficient for our vocation of conformity to Christ. Our nature in its current form, they claim, has the qualities or characteristics it needs to conform to Christ and does not need to acquire additions to them or even extensions of them. This point is a modest one because it does not entail that biotechnological enhancement is inconsistent with conformity to Christ or can make no contribution to it. But it is nevertheless an important one because there are Catholic and Protestant proponents of biotechnological enhancement, many of them influenced by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who argue that genuine conformity to Christ is achieved at least in part by the technological transformation of human nature. If we can demonstrate that human nature as it is sufficient for the vocation of human dignity to conform to Christ, then we will dissociate biotechnological enhancement in principle from that vocation, even if we do not demonstrate that it is incompatible with it or can contribute nothing at all to it. Tanner and Barth construct their positions around three claims. First, that Christ is the image of God in the proper sense. Second, that other humans participate in the image of God, both by sharing Christ's human nature and by the conformity of their lives to Christ. And third, that human nature, including biological nature, equips humans to participate in the image of God in these ways. In addition, they claim that human nature resembles God in certain respects, and to that extent images God in a weak sense. But I'm not going to pay attention to that last point. In what follows, I will focus on the proper sense in which Christ images God, and the sense in which other humans image God by participation in Christ. And above all, I will focus on the claim that human nature has the characteristics that make this participation possible and does not need to acquire different characteristics, whether through technology or in some other way. In her book, Christ the Key, Tanner claims that God wants to give us the fullness of God's own life. But we are human, not God, So we must receive and be remade by the divine word in order to share God's life. The question of human nature concerns the qualities or capacities that enable this reception and remaking to occur. How does our nature, including our biological nature, equip us to receive and be remade by the word? Tanner answers this question in terms of the image of God, which for her has several levels. First, at the highest level, is the Word, the second person of the Trinity, who shares the divine nature and thus images God as the perfect manifestation of all that the first person is. This is the image of God in its most proper sense. By contrast to the Word, humans image God by participating in what they are not, namely God. So at the second level, Christ's humanity, by virtue of its hypostatic union with the Word, images God with the fullness of creaturely perfection. Other humans, of course, lack this hypostatic union with the Word, but they approximate it in their own manner as they draw near through Christ to the divine image and cling to it. Third, other humans image God as their creaturely lives are remade in accordance with their attachment to the Word. This level corresponds to the conformity to Christ mentioned in communion and stewardship. At these second and third levels, humans image God by participation in what they are not, the divine image itself. We can now ask how our nature equips us to image God by participating in what we are not. And according to Tanner, it's the almost unlimited capacity of human nature to be shaped by our surroundings and by our intentional action. That is, the plasticity of our nature that enables humans to receive God's image and be remade by it, participating in what they are not. Tanner makes 2 points about human nature which together are relevant to the question of biotechnological enhancement. First, it is the plasticity of human nature that renders it susceptible to the influence of the Holy Spirit, who works on natural human capacities so that they become capable of acts or states that go beyond the capability of created nature as such. By going beyond the capabilities of created nature, humans are able to participate in what they are not, to image God in their attachment to Christ and their conformity to him, and thus to share God's own life. Taken alone, this claim might justify or at least permit a rather radical program of biotechnological enhancement. If human nature is plastic in the first place, and if its capabilities must go beyond what is natural to it as a creature in order to participate in what it is not, then it would seem difficult to object in principle to even the most ambitious transhumanist scenarios, which indeed might provide valuable indications of the plasticity of human nature and thus its suitability to participation in what it is not. However, Tanner makes another point about human nature, which is that due to its plasticity, our natural capacities remain what they are, even as they are worked over by the Spirit. No new capacities are needed beyond what we already have. The work of the Spirit does not require infused or superadded qualities, much less biotechnological alteration, to take us beyond nature. The plasticity of the natural capacities we already have is sufficient for that. To be sure, Tanner's position doesn't rule out biotechnological enhancement, but it is significant that for her, there is no deficiency of our nature that would call for it. Tanner's account of how human nature participates in the image of God, considered as conformity to Christ, illustrates the principle of communion and stewardship, that genuine human improvement is attained not by biotechnological enhancement, but by realizing more fully the image of God, by uniting with Christ and imitating him, in the words of CNS. At the same time, I worry about the notion that our natural characteristics are significant only to the extent that they enable us to transcend nature. I also find unsatisfactory the notion that it is by virtue of its plasticity that our nature equips us for conformity to the image of God in Christ. Plasticity is a general feature of human nature, if it characterizes human nature at all. And if we are really going to insist that our nature equips us to image God, we should be able to illustrate it with particular or concrete features. Karl Barth formulates a conception of the image of God that is similar to Tanner's, yet shows how certain basic and specific characteristics of our nature, which remains natural, enable us to conform to Christ. Like Tanner, Barth identifies the image of God in the most proper sense with Christ himself. Yet for him, it is not the Word as second person of the Trinity who is the image of God in the strong sense, as it is for Tanner, but rather, following Colossians 1:15, the Word incarnate, the firstborn of all creation. It is in his humanity, and thus in his creaturely nature, that Christ is the image of God in the primary sense or proper sense. What characterizes Jesus' humanity for Barth is his absolute and unconditional being for his fellow humans, which realizes in time the absolute and unconditional being for humanity that is God's eternal will and wisdom. In this sense, according to Barth, the humanity of Jesus is the repetition and reflection of God himself. It is the image of God. The image of God in this, its most proper sense, means that in Jesus' humanity, what God is in himself, namely for humanity, God is also ad extra for us. Barth develops this point in relation to several features of Jesus and our humanity, but I will consider just one of them, namely temporality. As living creatures, we occupy a limited span of time that begins with our birth and ends with our death. Barth argues that in the bounded lifespan he shares with us as part of human nature, Jesus is absolutely and unconditionally for us, thus imaging God in his humanity, and that our bounded lifespan images God in a secondary sense, as the characteristic that suits us to be those whom God in Jesus is for. In the same sense, we conform to Christ as we live our boundedness in such a way that it attests God's being for us in Jesus. So here's how the argument goes. God resolves from eternity to give human beings who are not eternal a share in God's eternity. To realize this purpose, God takes on time, becoming temporal in the bounded lifespan of Jesus' humanity. By raising Jesus from the dead, God frees his life and time from its particular confines and establishes its universal significance. This very time which God has assumed in becoming human is now freed to become God's gift to all human beings of every time. The time of every human being is thus determined by the time God has taken on and given to them. In this way, namely by virtue of the fact that their own time span is determined by the time span of Jesus, other human beings participate in the image of God, in a secondary sense, as they are in their own temporality those whom God is for. The boundedness of human life is the characteristic that suits us to be those whom God is for, and thus to image God in this secondary sense. By boundedness, Barth refers to the fact that our lives unfold in a time span that begins with birth and ends with death. Precisely because it is bounded in this way, by a beginning and an end that elude our agency and control, our life in its very biological structure equips us for dependence on the gracious gift of Christ's incarnate life, which determines our life from outside. In the same secondary sense, we conform to Christ as we live our bounded lives in such a way that they confirm his gift of the gift of his time for us. This secondary imaging of God in human nature can be illustrated by two brief examples that I draw out, more than find in Barth, but they're there, that demonstrate that human nature, as it is, has what it needs to image God. Some proponents of life extension technology appeal to a moral motivation for extending life as long as possible. They stress how much more a human being could accomplish if he or she could live for centuries rather than for mere decades. They dream of godlike accomplishment which presupposes a godlike responsibility for our lives and for the life of humanity in general. Although they have in mind a life that endures for a very long time and not one that is unbounded by birth and death, the goods they affirm are those of indefinite duration. By contrast, a bounded life is one in which our biological nature reminds us that it is not up to us to accomplish all that can be and must be accomplished for our vocation to be fulfilled and our perfection accomplished. The boundedness of our lives suits us to live by God's grace. And by living in this way, we conform to Christ, whose time is the gift given to our time. An unbounded life, second point now, an unbounded life would lack the specificity without which one cannot be a subject. In one's birth and death, Barth notes, one is irreplaceable, indispensable, and non-interchangeable. In these two events, one cannot be represented or replaced by another. Unlike all other events in one's life, here one is uniquely, unqualifiedly, and unalterably oneself. These two events thus give the life that runs from the one to the other the singular identity that is a necessary condition of responsibility, which requires one to answer for oneself. They also endow the particular, the contingent, the temporary, which would be meaningless in an unbounded life, with incomparable worth. Once again, this point is relevant in the context of life extension technology. Some proponents of radical life extension are enticed at the prospect of nearly limitless opportunity for self-transformation. Apparently, it will be biotechnology and not a political revolution that will enable a person, in Marx's famous words, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner. In the bounded life which we actually live, however, to pursue such an ideal would keep us from seizing the particular vocation that is actually available to us. A lifespan that is bounded by birth and death gives the life that runs from the one to the other the singular identity that is a condition for a specific human vocation, with the limited yet intensive ethical responsibility it involves. Of course, life must have some duration if we are to conform to Christ, and nothing Barth says helps us to know how much duration it should have, or even whether we can justifiably use technology to extend the duration of our lives. But he does remind us that we enact our dignity by living in a way that conforms to Christ. And the task in this context is to cultivate the meanings that inhere in boundedness in an era when life extension technologies, even if they never succeed, encourage us to cultivate the meanings that inhere in indefinite duration. Life extension technology, like everything else we might do to live longer, is justifiable or not, depending on whether it helps or hinders us in conforming to Christ, whose bounded life is a gift to ours. To conclude, Tanner and Barth demonstrate the point made by communion and stewardship that human beings can improve only by realizing more fully the image of God in themselves. And they demonstrate it by showing how our nature as it is enables us to realize that image and is not in need of biotechnological enhancement to do so. I stress that this is a modest conclusion, but it nevertheless is an important one. The prospect of biotechnological enhancement both draws on and reinforces the notion that our nature is perpetually inadequate to the goods that are proper to us. There is a point to that notion, since it is only in our resurrected bodies that we will image God in the fullest sense for which God created us. But the resurrection of the body is not the effect of any human action, biotechnological or otherwise. And if we are disabused of the notion that the determination of our biological characteristics can improve us in this most important way, perhaps we will be less likely to risk the disrespect to the dignity of others, which Pope John Paul II warned us against almost 25 years ago. Thank you.
had to take that out. I'm coming from my class. Jerry, I wasn't here from the very beginning of your talk, so pardon me if I'm missing something. But the model you're talking about, the technological imperative and all that, is one right to say that it's part of a secularizing tendency, where if, as Nietzsche would say, if God is out of the way, then the other thing is for man to grow. And if we ever acknowledge God, then it means we are acknowledging that we are dependent, we are limited, and we cannot be everything. And so, given this reality, my problem is how far we can go to acknowledge, therefore, what is a legitimate expression of the human God-given mandate to grow, to be better, to do better, and the other tendency, which is in fact a tendency you see coming out of, as you know, even in doctors and so on, who, when they see somebody die, are lamenting not simply the loss of life, but lamenting the failure of technology. Oh, we didn't get it right again this time. Because if we were not what we are, if we are what we are, that is, the creators of our own situation, of our own life, we should be able to solve this, and so on. So in other words, how do we begin to draw this line as Christians and as people who believe in God, who has given us the mandate to do whatever we can to improve life, to increase that, and vis-a-vis the other tendency that is also evident in the technological imperative which you so well described.
Yeah, good questions. I didn't go into all this in this paper, but I think it's difficult and sometimes in practice, but I think it's perfectly possible in principle to distinguish restoring human beings from conditions that are pathological conditions, which diseases and disorders and so on that I think reflect our fallen nature, well, not our created nature, on the one hand, from attempts to improve our created nature, on the other hand. Again, I don't think that distinction can be made rigorously in every case, but I think in general it can. So one question I think was implied in part of what you asked is, if we can use technology to treat diseases and restore health and prevent diseases and that sort of thing, and there's nothing problematic about technology in those cases. What is problematic about it in cases using technology to improve our lives in ways that have nothing to do with eliminating or treating diseases? And I think what I have said, at least implicitly, if we take that distinction seriously between therapy and enhancement, as it's shorthanded, I think what we then have to ask ourselves is what happens when we use technology to improve our lives. So if there's no absolute prohibition against technological enhancement, if it's done in such a way that it's not violating any basic moral norms, what is the reason, if any, that we wouldn't avail ourselves of technology in order to improve our lives? Well, I think there are a couple of points that could be made. One point, which I think the point that is behind that one sentence in Communion and Stewardship, is the assumption that our nature as created by God is somehow deficient is a questionable assumption. And but then we also have to, I think we have to ask the question, well, if we're, community stewardship number 24 refers to improving our lives through culture and education. So one of the questions that I think could be raised is, well, if life could be improved through culture and education, why can't it be improved through technology? In fact, some people would say, after all, technology is a part of culture. And I think that's right. I think technology is a part of culture. If I were going to elaborate the reasons why I think in the 1983 address, the different warnings are issued about the attitudes and stances towards human beings. One could say that some of those attitudes and stances are implied in education as well, or in other cultural endeavors. And, but I think the argument I would give is that that technology operates in interpersonal contexts in ways that, or biotechnology operates in ways that, or any kind of technology really operates in ways that are not simply neutral, as many people think of technology, but that because technology produces changes that are measurable, monitorable, because we can exercise, or we can generate measurable results, we can use criteria of efficiency and these sorts of things. Biotechnology acts on our nature in ways that, say, ordinary processes of education don't. Now, of course, ordinary processes of education, I think about this every time we talk about learning goals and measuring learning outcomes and things like this. There are senses in which the same kinds of same form of action is operative there, and the same sorts of concerns that one would have about reducing this in interpersonal interaction to what is measurable, efficient, and so forth. I think that spills into all kinds of activities, not just biotechnological ones. But it is inevitable in biotechnological activities in a way that it's not in educational activities. So, well, I think if I were to conclude these 2 points, there would be the first point that there's an implication that our nature, it's not just that our nature as it is incomplete in the sense that the nature that we are given requires cultivation in order to reach its potential, in order to ultimately conform to Christ, and that is a form of human improvement. That's a different claim from the claim that our nature is deficient. And I think most of biotechnological enhancement implies the latter. And then second, any effort to work on ourselves or work on others through technology is going to involve inherently risky, not necessarily procedures that should be prohibited, but inherently risky procedures, precisely because it tends to reduce things to measurability, efficiency, and so forth. So does that answer the question? Okay.
Okay, good. I have a kind of theologian's question, which kind of pushes in a different direction. The way in which Tanner, thank you by the way, Tanner and Bart outline this Christ in the image of God, and then secondly, humans participating in this image, and then thirdly, human nature equipping us to participate is the way in which you put the Bartian position. Strikes me as a kind of inversion of the Thomistic way of putting it, that the image of God is in all of us. First is the first claim, and then in the moral life it's embodied in the virtues of the just. And then in a different way, by a different power, is manifested in the life of the blessed, of the saints. And it seems to me that I just want to ask about, the plasticity of nature that Tanner talks about, and whether or not that kind of top-down Barthian approach doesn't look at the plasticity of nature differently than, say, a Thomistic way in which we have individual rational, substantial natures, which of course are changeable, and all of the fathers talk about the changeability of human nature being, this gift of that we're changeable means that the fall can be reversed, and that we can be elevated, not only to the image of God, but also to the image of Christ. And I wonder if you would comment on the way in which the Barthian framework is or is not an inversion of the Thomistic framework, and how that influences the conception of nature and how one thinks about enhancements of it.
Here, I think I distinguish between Bart and Tanner, and I take Bart's approach. I think the points you make are points in which Tanner's position might be problematic. I think she has a very deflationary way of talking about human nature as God created it, as being in the image of God. She calls it a weak sense, and I think she really means weak. It's not just weak because it's mere resemblance. It's weak because it seems to be almost a mere starting point, and I don't think one can do justice to the notion of our nature as created by God in that way. So I think that's a problem. But Bart has a different position, and it's different from the Thomistic position. But for Bart, from eternity, God willed to be in a communion with a being other than God, and in a sense that is difficult to explain without going into a lot of the details of Bart's Trinitarian theology. God determines that in Jesus Christ from eternity. That doesn't mean that Jesus Christ is a human being from eternity, but in God's resolve, God wills, Trinity resolves that God will be God in relation to another, and from eternity, God has in mind, if you will, or in God's resolve, the incarnation. So when God creates human beings, God creates them with a view to this communion. So the characteristics of human nature are made because in God's wisdom, those are the characteristics which God wanted us to have as those who are created for communion with Him. So there's a very important sense in which our creaturely nature from the very beginning images God. In fact, it images Christ. But there's also, he is committed to saying that Christ is the image of God. Christ, even with respect to his human nature, is the image of God in the most proper sense, because it was that eternal resolve to be, by God to be with and for an other, that is from God's mind. Christ's nature, if you will, precedes our nature. And he understands, it is an exegetical position for him. He understands Colossians 1:15 this way. What does it mean to say Jesus Christ is the firstborn of all creation? Well, it means human creatures means, among other things, human creatures are created with the characteristics that God from eternity has in mind in choosing human beings in Christ to be with God. So does that, I don't know if that answers your question, but it does mean that Bart can say unqualifiedly that the created characteristics we have are those characteristics which God wills us to have from eternity as those creatures who are created to be in communion with God.
But we only know that from Revelation.
That's right. That we only know from Revelation. Now, we do. I think I've thought about this set of issues about our biological nature as it is, having the characteristics that it needs in order to conform to Christ, and I think I can truthfully say that I never would have looked for these claims in Barth's work if I hadn't read Leon Cass first. And I don't know if Dr. Cass is here right now, but we could go further. What Barth says about birth and death was said by Hannah Arendt. What Barth says about death was said by Jonas and Cass, Heidegger, and so on and so forth. So while the specific image of God language is obviously known by revelation, it's obviously a revealed truth, the notion that somehow our biological nature as it is has some sufficiency with respect to the human good, I don't think is simply knowable, or is only known, I should say, by revelation.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm happy to hear this theological, Christological approach to this issue that I tend to think in moral or political terms. And my question is not a theological one. It strikes me that when you know people who are heavily damaged, handicapped after an accident, etc., or by birth, the way they deal with their limitations is the opposite logic of human enhancement, is the acceptance of their limitations in their experience. The way they tell you they live it is that I don't want to have another arm. This is who I am, and I'm happy with my single arm or with my spine broken or whatever. So I wonder, I think it's implicit in what you said, but what are the psychological and political implications of this approach to human limitations, to vulnerability, handicapped people? Because I think in the public debate about these issues, this could be maybe Christological argument, might not work very well, but this other thing that, actual people who have problems follow the complete opposite logic, and that's what works for real people.
It's very, there are two questions really. One is, can this be formulated in ways that observe the legitimate rules of speech in the public realm? And I think I just answered that question well. On both of these aspects of dignity with respect to our biological nature, Jürgen Habermas did that. In their own ways, Leon Cass and others have done that in terms of course, not explicitly conformity to Christ, but in terms of our ultimate human good, however one conceives that. So I think in terms, can this position be formulated in a way that observes the, as I say, the legitimate rules of speech in the public realm? I think yes. Now, is it likely to gain adherence in the public realm? And I think that's not the case. Leon Cass can tell you how that's not the case. Gerald Nylander, sitting in the back of the room, he can tell you how that would not be the case. Jürgen Habermas, the broader argument that he was carrying out was an argument related to the German basic law and specific applications of that law to pre-implementation genetic diagnosis. He failed. The position that he ultimately failed. I think he initially succeeded, but ultimately his position failed. So, and the question is, why do positions that could be articulated in public terms fail in the public realm? And I think it's because I think we'd have to raise a lot of questions about the way in which biological nature has now become the point at which modern societies carry out the, you could say, I guess, utopian or emancipatory ideals that were once thought to be able to be carried out by politics. So I think in certain ways, modern political commitments to the improvement of human life which over the course of the 20th century have failed in the political realm, are increasingly being pursued in the biological realm. So I don't think one can gain much traction on these issues in the public realm without addressing the assumptions that it's the task of politics or medicine or whatever to improve human life in those ways.
So friends, we're at the end of the hour.
Oh, sorry.
I was maybe going to mention my question, but not have you answer it. Is that fair? That's not fair, is it?
Go ahead.
Can I say it as an observation? Your talk made me remember people like St. Irenaeus who say that death is a punishment for sin, but a remedial punishment. And I wonder if your talk fits, like, takes off a little bit from that theological insight that in some way in a fallen world, mortality or death, I'm not talking about unjust and early death,
Right.
but is a constitutive element of our human dignity. So I'll leave that as a question. That's all.
And I would just say, it's one thing to say that in the case of mortality, it's another thing to say it in the case of death. Okay. And I would say it in the case of mortality.
Friends, let's give Jerry